Oops. Yeah, just a big dumb oops. Okay. Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Sustainable Design Masterclass. I'm Raleigh Latham. I am joined here by Neil Spackman and the one and only Tony Rinaudo. I am so stoked. We're so stoked to be back with you, joining you guys. Right now I'm coming from Bratislava. I'm on the road on a rewilding bike tour. But yeah, we've been looking forward to this webinar for quite a while. Sustainable Design Masterclass, if for some of you guys who are new, is designated to bring you some of the top regenerative system designers in the world. These are people who are doing absolutely incredible things with ecology, with regenerative businesses, with entrepreneurship, with farming. These are people who are just changing the face of agriculture from one of destruction to regeneration. So I'm just super stoked to be bringing you guys pioneers like Tony Rinaudo and, of course, Neil. So without further ado, yeah, we're recording this presentation. We're going to do a live Q&A. Turn off your Facebook, turn off your phones, because you want to be present for this, because that's going to be amazing. So
That's right.
I'm going to turn it over to Neil. Neil, how about you give Tony the intro, because you've got
You
a
bet.
lot to say about him.
Tony and I first came in contact about a year ago. I had heard about Tony from Jeff Lawton and had looked up his work. And he did a webinar with the World Agroforestry Program about a year ago. And I watched that, and then I wrote Tony and kind of introduced myself and said, hey, I'm doing this work in Saudi Arabia, really interested in what you've been doing. And we've had an ongoing conversation since then. But ever since we started the webinar, I've wanted to have Tony on because he's the work he's done over the last 20, 30 years in sub-Saharan Africa and the way that it has grown as a from the grassroots is not just really inspiring, but a model that I think anyone working in an international development should try to mimic. But also it's incredibly hopeful for millions of families in that part of the world, and there's a lot of momentum growing behind Tony. I'm really, really excited to have him here for all of you to listen to and to hear his story. So Tony, thanks so much for coming on, and we're going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Neil and Wayne, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be sharing with you. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I have great respect for the permaculture movement, and I've been greatly influenced over the years by Jeff and others in that movement. So it's a real privilege for me to be sharing with you today. So I'm going to tell a little bit of the story and how it unfolded, and talk about the impacts of farmer-managed natural regeneration, and then where we're at today through rolling it out through World Vision, the organization that I work with today. So Wayne, next slide, please. So my family and I went to Niger Republic in West Africa in 1980. We were actually missionaries working in an agricultural project. And we were pretty young back then, and you can imagine looking at that landscape. I think I was in a state of shock for the first few years because nothing at university had prepared me for the situation there. And keep in mind, this is not actually Sahara Desert. This is their prime agricultural land. And in my lifetime, when I was a child growing up in Australia, this would have been a biodiverse, semi-arid landscape. There would have been trees, wildlife, even pools of water that lasted for much of the year. And in the short span of 20 to 30 years, mostly through human intervention, it had been reduced to this. So there was massive deforestation and desertification, and there were great consequences of that. People were really suffering. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So, for example, the top left photo there, that's millet that's been planted and it's germinated, but people were having to replant up to 5 or 6 times, because the germinating plants would get sandblasted. Often they would get buried. There was just no protection from the wind, and we would have 70-kilometre-per-hour winds at planting time. And if you look very closely there, that's been abraded and it's starting to desiccate. And people didn't have a magic pot of seed. Every time they replanted, they were actually planting what they should have been eating. And so every year, even in a non-famine year, people were suffering. There was a gap period before the next harvest came in, if indeed it did come in. And you can see the tree there buried by the sand dune. More and more often, what wasn't cleared by people for farming, the encroaching desert would overrun anyway. Next slide. Even in a normal season, we only had a 4-month rainy period, and it was normal, part of the cycle there, to have 8 months of dry season. And so if you had a drought on top of the normal dry season, it was devastating for livestock. And you can see the condition of the cow, the bull on the left there. And very often, if you had drought following the dry season, there would be massive loss of livestock as well. Next slide. With the loss of biodiversity, there was an explosion in crop pests. So when you lose the trees, you lose insect-eating birds, spiders, lizards, and so on. And in the years when their crops were successful, you would have a monoculture of millet from one end of the country to the other. So you just had this massive breeding ground for all types of insect pests. And even if you had a good rainy season, there was no guarantee of getting a crop, because there was such an onslaught of different kinds of pests. Sometimes it might have been just the locusts. Sometimes it might have been different types of caterpillars. Often you'd have a combination of different things with devastating effect. Next slide. And we were involved in famine relief 5 separate years during our time there. People did the best that they could. Usually the menfolk, you can see the truck loaded up with people, but usually anybody above the age of about 12 to 15 would go to neighboring countries, to larger cities, looking for food and for work to send back to the women. And the women who stayed behind and the children were the ones who really suffered. Next slide. And I mentioned that this was actually a very biodiverse landscape with trees, with water, with wildlife. By the time we got there in 1980, this photo was taken in 1984, the trees had been stripped from the land. One estimate that I saw was that there were only about 4 trees per hectare on the landscape. And so when you did get a drought year and the winds whipped up, you can see the effect there, where it's actually overrunning an abandoned village. Next slide. And so there I was, still very young, very inexperienced, and quite shocked by the situation that I came into. And we were trying everything through tree nurseries. We read widely, we consulted with the government nurseries, with other NGOs, we experimented. Everything that we tried was pretty much a failure, and besides that, the people themselves weren't very interested in trees. Their main concern, they wanted food, they wanted to grow cash crops. And as far as they were concerned, I was quite crazy, and they actually called me the Mad White Farmer. And 2.5 years into trying to convince people of the value of trees and to look after these transplanted trees, I was getting very, very frustrated, because most of those trees died and the people weren't interested. And I knew instinctively that if agriculture was going to be viable at all, they had to have some level of tree cover to protect the crops from the wind and to buffer the worst effects of drought and to provide some kind of biodiversity, some habitat for natural predators of the pests that they had. And people weren't interested. What we were trying was failing. And I could have very well given up at that point. I was just so frustrated. I was ready to come home. But I did feel that I was meant to be there. And for me, personally, the solution came as an answer to prayer. I really didn't know what to do. And if you look closely there, on this day, I'm letting the air pressure out so that we can travel through the sandy countryside more easily. And in the background, there's a little, what looks like a bush. And usually you just drive past, you'd ignore these insignificant looking bushes. They could have been weeds for all I knew. But for some reason this day I took a closer look. And as soon as I saw the leaf structure on the bush, I realized that it was actually a tree. It was the same leaf as was on some of the remnant trees in that landscape. And in that instant, everything changed. And I realized I wasn't fighting against the Sahara Desert. It really didn't matter. It wasn't a question of my budget or the time frame I had or the number of staff that I have. Those issues were secondary. The real battle lines were over hearts and minds. And if it was people and communities that had reduced the landscape to that degraded state, it would take people and communities to restore it. And the real battle was if I could convince people that it was in their best interest to leave some of these trees, allow them to regrow into tree size, if I could convince them of the value of that, the rest would be easy. The trees would regenerate without any inputs. And so if you look in the landscape there, there's actually a lot of these little bushes, and I call this the underground forest because the trees are there, you just can't see them. Next slide, please. So if we had special vision and we could see beneath the surface of the ground, you'd realize that when you cut a tree down, for most species, the tree doesn't die, and at least 50% of the mass of the tree is still alive underground, and you've got this massive root system under the stump, and that has access to moisture and to nutrients, and also a lot of stored sugars in the roots themselves. And if you just click that one more time, that's all we see. We just see that little bush on top. But actually 50% of the tree's still there. And it's like having a V8 engine that's turned on, but it's in neutral. And it's got all that energy, all that pent-up ability to go fast, but it won't go anywhere until you put it in gear. And so we worked with the farmers to help them put these trees into gear, meaning if we can just manage the livestock movements until those shoots can get up to a certain height, if we can resist cutting it out again and ploughing over it, resist burning, and thin and prune those stems so that there's not so much competition, then effectively you've put that tree stump into gear, and contrary to popular belief, the growth will actually be very, very rapid. You know, most people around the world believe that trees grow very slowly, and a lot of farmers who are living on the edge and who need fast results from whatever they spend their time on, they can't be bothered with tree work because they believe it might take a decade or longer to see benefits. They need to put food on the table today. And so one of the big hurdles in convincing people to take up this practice was to demonstrate that actually the benefits come very, very quickly. Next slide, please. And so here's a definition of FMNR. It's the systematic regeneration and management of trees and shrubs growing from stumps. Sometimes people have cut the stumps out and there's only the roots left. And you can often regenerate trees from roots and sometimes from seeds in the ground. And we can do this on agricultural land, on grazing land, on degraded forest, even on wasteland. And it's more about the management than anything else. If you manage this regrowth properly, nature does the rest. And you can see here, it's quite a simple process. The diagram on the left there's many stems growing from one tree stump. And I've seen maybe 30, even up to 50 stems from the one stump. If you do nothing, eventually that will become a tree, but it could take a decade or more. And the management part of FMNR is to thin and to prune to allow more rapid growth so that all the energy in the roots is pushing up into fewer stems. And then you might select up to 5. And I actually prefer leaving more initially, even if ultimately I only want 1 stem on that tree. Initially, it's better to leave 5, particularly in a developing country context, where there's a great shortage of fuel wood and people might want stakes for beans or small poles for their building their huts. If you leave 5, then they can selectively harvest over a 5-year time frame without eliminating the main trunk that you want to leave. Also, in most developing countries, there's no fencing. And so it adds a measure of protection. It's much harder for an ox or for a goat to break a clump of 5 stems than it is to break a single stem. So FMNR itself is very, very simple, and I have to confess, it's not even a new idea. It's ancient. The technical terms are coppicing and pollarding. There's absolutely nothing new about this. If anything, all I've done is made a rediscovery of a traditional practice. And if you take that concept, it's actually very, very beneficial. When I'm traveling to new countries and I'm trying to bring in this idea, I can tell them outright that this isn't a white idea, it's not an exotic idea, it's actually indigenous. And what we're trying to do here is revive beneficial indigenous practices. And that gives you a great leg in when you're going to new areas. Next slide. As well as being something to do with regenerating trees, at the base of this, it's actually a regreening of mindsets. And if you win on this plane, then you win the battle. If it were people that brought the landscape to its knees, it's going to require people to restore it. And any tree planting scheme, any FMNR scheme that hasn't won the hearts and minds of people and convinced them that it's in their best interest to do this, you've failed from the start. So this is where the real battle lines are, winning hearts and minds of people. Next slide. And so very, very rapidly, amazingly rapidly, we went from seeing landscapes like the one in the top left corner to landscapes like the one in the top right corner. There's only about 3 years between those 2 photos. Even on that top left corner slide, there are tree stumps buried beneath the surface. And all that's happened there was that we convinced the farmers to not cut out the regrowth each year in preparation for farming, select the stems that they want, and then protect them to a certain degree until they're up and able to withstand grazing pressure. And you can see the impact there. The bottom left corner is the first year after beginning to select and prune the regrowth. And already, because people have harvested a few of those branches and the stems to use as fuel wood, that's freed them up to leave some of the crop residue, the stubble, on the field as mulch and to protect the ground and eventually to rot down and become organic matter. So already there are other factors starting to kick in there. It's more than just the trees. We're starting to improve soil fertility and growing conditions. In the bottom right corner, and this would be maybe 3 to 4 years after starting, you can see the farmer there. There's actually a pile of wood that he's harvested behind him. He's left a main trunk there to harvest perhaps next year. And then there's 3 or 4 small shoots in front of him that he's grooming to harvest in the future. So he's got a sustainable system going there. He'll never leave that farmland devoid of trees, and he's growing his crops right up to the base of the tree. So one of the other myths that we had to contend with was that people believed that trees and crops were incompatible. And to a certain degree that's true, but it's not universally true. So there's some tree species, they might be nitrogen fixing or in some way synergistic. In the case of this one, it's Philostigma reticulata. It actually draws water from deep in the soil profile, and it leaks that water in the shallow root system, making moisture available to the crop plants. So there are certain species that are compatible with crops, and you have control over how many trees you will regenerate and how severely you prune them. So the farmer actually has a large degree of control over how much competition there is with the crops. And as a general rule of thumb, we were finding that with trees, farmers were getting a doubling of the crop yield. Some farmers even a triple, because of the improved microclimate, the improved soil fertility, cancelling out any negative factors of the competition that might have occurred. Next slide. And you can see here the graph in the bottom. Those trials were done in Senegal. Farmers with no trees on their land were getting just the district average yields of about 300 kilos of grain per hectare. And then with no other inputs, no irrigation, no fertilizer, no improved seed, on the same land but with trees, they were getting more than double, 700, it's about 780 kilograms of grain per hectare. And then, of course, you can always improve on that. If you put other organic matter or use Zyhol methods for capturing more moisture, you can improve on that even more. But just by adding trees into the landscape, you're getting a more than doubling of crop yield. The photo on the top left was taken in a drought year. And you can see there that the only place where the crop is not only surviving, but it's actually thriving is at the base of the tree. So you've got greater organic matter, less evaporation, slightly cooler temperatures. You would have maybe predators of insects living in that tree. For a number of reasons, it makes more sense in those environments to have agroforestry, to have trees in your cropland, than to not have them. Next slide. So here, just a close-up of the FMNR in the first year. That was bare land. There were tree stumps there. The farmers started selecting and pruning, and they're beginning to leave the crop residue on the land and improve the soil conditions as well. Next slide. And close-up of the farmer, and you get a better view there that he's in front of him. He's actually got 3 smaller shoots that he's grooming to grow to full size in the future. Just to his right, there's a younger stem that might be ready for harvest in 2 or 3 years. And further to his right, there's the larger stem that he would harvest maybe in the following year. So he's got a sustainable system there. But there's no single correct way to do FMNR. we found that some farmers have graduated from this approach to only harvesting upper branches. And they might take a third of the branches in 1 year, and then the next year the next third, and then the next year the next third, because you'll get much faster growth. You're not competing with the goats in the early stages, and they just prefer that system. So there's many ways of tackling this. Next slide. Oh, what began to happen very, very quickly was initially people met their domestic fuelwood needs, and it had been a desperate situation prior to this. Women were walking for many kilometres to get fuelwood. Children were kept out of school to help their mums. In the absence of wood, people would use straw, which should have been going back onto the field as mulch and organic matter. People were using cow manure, and even the manure of goats. So it was very undignified. You imagine the shame of having to scrape up goat pellets to use as your cooking fuel. Almost overnight, that situation was reversed. And as people met their own domestic needs and a surplus was produced, markets began to spring up in the bush villages. And so instead of people, what was happening previously, people would go to the cities to buy their fuel wood and their building poles. The city merchants were starting to come to these same villages, and bush markets were set up to sell fuel wood. But the difference was now this was a sustainable supply. The farmers were definitely harvesting a lot of wood, but they were replacing it with the FMNR process. Then you can see on the bottom right corner, some of the more enterprising farmers realize you don't make much money from wood and from charcoal. And with the same volume of wood, if they added value, if they made hut roofs and tool handles and furniture, they might get 5 to 10 times more income from the same amount of wood. So backyard cottage industries were starting to emerge as well. Next slide. You know, we didn't really realize, or we didn't know the impact of FMNR nationwide until many years later. We knew that the practice was being adopted in at least 100 villages where I worked in the Maradi district of Niger. And for a number of years, we had accepted any NGOs, any individuals, any government agency to come and spend time with our villages, and we would train them in FMNR. We also sent our farmers and our staff to the four corners of Niger, but there was never any feedback. And it wasn't until 2004 that I had access to these satellite images. And you can see on the left-hand side there, the black dots are trees. It's very, very sparsely vegetated landscape. Average tree density was just 4 trees per hectare back then. By 2003, the photo on the right shows the density had risen to 45 trees per hectare, and some farmers leaving even over 100 trees. And this wasn't dedicated forest land, this was agricultural land. They were still growing crops on that retreed landscape. Next slide. Nationwide, it spread at that time, a few years ago, 2004, the figure was 5 million hectares. And they've just done a new survey this year. They've upped that figure. There's actually 7 million hectares with an average tree density of 45 trees per hectare. And the growth there is phenomenal. It's mind-boggling. If you do the sums, that was an average rate of 250,000 hectares per year being reforested, and we didn't even know about it. This was a people movement. This was not orchestrated. We'd let the genie out of the bottle. People saw the value. They either observed it and copied it or learnt it off their neighbours, and it spread from farmer to farmer, pretty much without our knowledge. And I've tried to read very widely on reforestation in different parts of the world. I've never seen a similar figure, anything that comes anywhere near to this, and certainly not at the cost that it cost us. It costs next to nothing. On a per hectare basis, this intervention costs next to nothing. Now, if you look at the total budget that I had at my disposal, and I lived in Niger over 17 years, I doubt that I spent more than $2 million in 17 years. And if you spread that over 7 million hectares, it's peanuts compared to the cost of a typical reforestation project, which might come in the hundreds of dollars per hectare, depending on what degree of investment you make into it. So it really is quite a unique story. Next slide, please. So different figures now. I joined World Vision in 1999, and I've been rolling this out in the various countries that we work in. But I'll just give you a minute or so to look at that and see the impact on tree density in different countries. So you can see there different countries have taken up FMNR at different rates, and the response has been different. But what the trend that we see is, as they warm to it, some countries faster, some countries a little bit slower, but as they warm to it, the same pattern that we saw in Niger, where there's this gradual and then more rapid uptake of FMNR, and then this organic movement that spreads from farmer to farmer. That's what we're that's what we're starting to see in the various countries we've introduced this to. Next slide, please. And along with that reforestation, you've now got a foundation for food security and enhancement of livelihoods. In the top left corner, he's harvested some wild fruits. And again, in the bottom left corner, once you've got trees, it gives the foundation for having a honey industry. If you allow the trees to grow big enough, you have the possibility of having millable timber, and so on. And so we've found it to be very foundational. All the other things that we're doing in development activities in World Vision, this is actually very foundational for kickstarting and providing the ability to be sustainable in what we introduce. Next slide. And again, these figures come from independent studies, but the figures are mind-boggling. And to put it in context, I'll just give you a minute to read that. So those figures in the context are mind-boggling. Niger is often listed on the UN HDI as the poorest country in the world. It's often listed 174th out of 174. It's on the edge of the Sahara Desert. There was minimal investment by government and by non-government organizations in the reforestation sector, or in food security for that matter. And yet here's this movement that was pretty much organic and people-driven in the poorest country in the world, producing the equivalent of $900 million per year, every year, with no ongoing investment by a project. And in a country that's racked by drought and recurring famine, they're producing every year an estimated 500,000 tons of additional grain. So I think in development circles we get a bit jaded, we get a little bit blinded by numbers, and the significance of this can be lost on us. But these are figures to kill for. These are results that are enviable, and they pretty much happened under the radar screen. Most people haven't picked up on the impact of FMNR in that poor country. And I think if more NGOs and more donors and more development actors were aware of the significance of this, there would be mass adoption of FMNR globally. Next slide. So this photo is taken in Uganda, and in many countries people burn the landscape every year. They burn their crop residues, they burn the communal pasture lands. And the idea is that on the farmland, a clean farmer is a good farmer, and so they get rid of all the trash. And on the grazing land, their thinking is the burning gets rid of the coarse, dry grass and forces a green flush of growth from the grass stumps. And that's true, it does, but it's a very temporary benefit, and in the long term it's very destructive to the soils and leads to desertification, actually. This farmer, within 1 or 2 years of practicing FMNR and stopping burning, he was able to increase his livestock carrying capacity 450% without overgrazing. You can see the length of the grass there, and so they're eating grass, but also for some of those tree species, the leaves are edible and the seed pods are edible. So he's massively increased his grass production, and he's selling poles, he's selling firewood, and he's added beehives to his farming enterprise. And so almost overnight, people have turned from being less than subsistence farmers and relying on manual labor when they can find it, day labor when it's available, and it's not often available, to seeing themselves as being their farm as being an enterprise and providing the bulk and maybe the entirety of their livelihoods. Next slide. And again, this guy used to go from farm to farm looking for work. And often he'd earn so little, it wouldn't cover his costs of transport and the meal that he'd need to eat while he was out looking for work. And so it was just a miserable existence, and his farm was just where he happened to live. It wasn't an enterprise. It wasn't providing for the family's food needs. And again, within 2 years, he's turned that situation around. He's got beehives, firewood, there's enough fodder for his cows, milk production has increased. He's building a hay shed so that he can take advantage of higher prices later in the season. It's totally turned his situation around. And what he said to me when I met him the second after he'd adopted FMNR, he said, "Tony, my farm employs me." And that's a very, very different picture from 2 years prior to that. Next slide. And it's been really revolutionary. I mentioned earlier that there were wind speeds of 70 kilometers an hour, and they would bury the crop, they would damage it, people would have to replant five or more times. That's completely stopped now. This was a typical scene when we first entered Niger. Next slide. In the 1970s, there were whole books written about the other energy crisis. We learned about the oil energy crisis, but in Africa and other places, there was a fuel energy crisis. And unfortunately, we haven't documented the change, but there has been an energy revolution in the countries that have taken up FMNR, and women who were walking up to 4 hours just to collect firewood. And that had detrimental effect on their health. It meant they had no time for other useful activities, marketing or looking after the family. And often, despite all of their efforts, there was still a great shortage of fuel. that's been completely turned around in Niger at least. And not only people meeting their domestic needs, but the ever-growing cities, which were destroying the remnant forests. In Maradi, where I lived, the forests had disappeared, and they were making a retreat across the border into Nigeria. Each year, the marketers were going further and further to collect the wood, destroying the forests as they went. That's completely halted now, and a sustainable supply of energy has been supplied to these big cities. So it's unfortunately not documented, but it's a story in itself, and a massive turnaround in the situation. Next slide. And if you just click quickly to the following slide as well, it shows the transition in a 2-year period on this hill in Ghana. And if you go back and forward a little bit, it'll just show the same site transition in a 2-year period. So farmers in this region in northern Ghana, they'd given up hope, and they said if conditions got any worse, they'd be packing up and going to the capital city, because they just couldn't make ends meet anymore. There was no fodder, women walking many kilometers to get fuel wood, crops failing, children not in school. It was a miserable situation, and within just 2 years of practicing this, it restored their hope. As they saw the landscape restored, it made them realize if they looked after the environment that they'd been given, that their inheritance, if they worked with nature, instead of hitting it on the head each year and burning it and cutting it and overgrazing it, it could be so much more productive. It could be bountiful. And it's just transformed that community. Next slide. Another project in southern Ethiopia. Top left's photo is was taken before the project started. You can actually see the bare ground on the hill. That land in the valley was subject to flooding. When it did rain, it would run off the mountain there and cause severe damages and sometimes loss of life and infrastructure in the valley. People were not investing in agriculture because it was too risky, so they would just practice traditional agriculture, low investment, low risk agriculture, but having very poor results. And again, within just 1 to 2 years of treating that landscape differently and regenerating the trees, the flooding stopped, people had fodder, access to fuel wood. They actually sell tree seeds to the forestry department. They produce honey. They sell traditional medicines, and so on and so forth. If you go there, they claim, and unfortunately we haven't set up a weather station, but they say that it is measurably, it's sensibly cooler in their environment now than it was before they started this work. Last year there was a massive drought across Ethiopia, and maybe 15 to 20 million people were receiving food aid. Before this project started, World Vision entered this community in 1984, and we provided food aid to one degree or another for about 30 years. Within 6 years of this project starting and reforesting the hill, and if you go to the next slide, I think there's a figure there, but the situation totally turned around. And so what's the figure? Okay, so last year during that drought year, this one community, and keep in mind there are actually 7 communities doing the same work, but I visited this one community in a drought year when 15 to 20 million people in Ethiopia were receiving food aid. This community has stored 30 tons of grain. Just phenomenal. And 6 years after the project started, the 7 cooperatives sold 106 tons of grain to the World Food Programme. And that's following 30 years of dependency on World Vision handouts. So what changed? The microclimate changed. They told me, Tony, yes, we received less rains last year than usual, but what we observed was when the clouds did come and they hit that mountain, they were more likely than not to drop their moisture. And then what moisture fell, even though it was less than average, it was more effective because the temperature was cooler, there was less wind, and there was more organic matter in the soil to hold that moisture. And so this is why I say that FMNR, it's somehow foundational to sustainable development. You need a healthy functioning environment to build sustainable agricultural base upon. Next slide. Just for anyone that's interested, that particular project is also a carbon trading project, and from 2006 when it started to 2000 and I think this graph was taken last year, so 2016, it had sequestered around 100,000 tons of carbon. But I just threw that in case anybody was interested in climate change and carbon sequestration. Next slide. I believe going into the future, particularly in countries in the tropics and semi-arid tropics, that unless farmers have trees on their land, they won't be able to produce a crop. And you can see there the temperature differences. Air temperature, 45 in the open, 35 in the shade. But look at the soil temperature difference, 71 degrees Celsius out in the open compared to 36. And what's happening is crops growing in these regions are already growing at the upper limit of their optimum temperature range. And when you go beyond around 35 degrees, for every 1 degree increase in temperature, you have a 10% decline in crop yield. And with climate change, the predictions for these regions, or in Africa especially, you might have up to a 5 degree or more increase in temperature. That means a 50% drop in crop yield. And so what I tell farmers as I travel around the world is, if you want to stay in business, if you want to keep feeding your family, you have to do this. It's not a matter of being a tree hugger. It's not a matter of it being aesthetically pleasing. It's actually a matter of survival for a number of reasons. And yeah, I think it's just critically important. A light covering of trees, just an average tree density over a farm can reduce air temperatures 10 degrees. So it's effectively buying us time in the race against climate change. Next slide. In some areas, we've just been astounded at the impact on the water cycle. So in this particular area in Tigray, northern Ethiopia, they've combined FMNR at scale with soil and water conservation measures. So they've been digging digettes, contoured ditches. Wherever there was an erosion gully, they would plug it up and convert it into a dam, forcing the water to soak into the ground. And that, in combination with the tree work, the lower temperatures and the higher organic matter in the soil, it's recharged the water table. And this community was threatened with relocation. The government had been feeding them for 20 years. And they said to them, that's not sustainable. We're going to move you to virgin bushland. You're going to clear the bush and start over. Well, that's ridiculous. It would have just repeated the cycle that had occurred here. The community decided to stay, and they changed the way they managed the landscape. Within 2 years, they were able to dig around 600 shallow wells in the valley because the water table had risen. And now, even in a drought year, they can still grow 2 or 3 crops because they have irrigation. And that center slide there, it's quite amazing. The water is coming out of the ground under pressure they put a PVC pipe in the ground, expecting to need to pump for water, and the water rose up out of the ground under pressure. Just amazing. Next slide. Yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. Wayne, if you could throw up, I sent you a photo separately. I was just in Niger last week, and if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, there was a photo with me in a barren landscape, and I was letting the air pressure out of the tires. Yeah, so we're hoping the photo will come up, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact same position, but I was very close to that vicinity. And if you see the photo, if it comes up there on the screen, there's probably 40 or 50 trees per hectare on that same land that looked like Sahara Desert. Yeah, we've got it there now. So I was very thrilled. I left Niger in '99. And there's been no effective project working in the area, no government support, but the farmers have maintained that high level of tree cover on that farmland ever since. So that's all I have to say on the presentation. I'll open it to you again, Neil, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
You bet. Thanks so much, Tony. That was fantastic stuff. That was just amazing stuff.
My pleasure.
That was really cool.
A couple comments from my side, because this is a theme that we see with a lot of folks that we bring on the webinar. That the key to having an agriculture that's sustainable is having an agriculture that maintains ecological function. And the problems that we see of the farmers in Niger who were losing soil. Their rainfall was not effective in not nourishing their plants. They had a lot of loss due to wind and other climatic elements. All of these are typical of desertifying landscapes, and that by restoring the ecological services those trees had, it had this entire chain reaction of effects that we see in a lot of other places. I'm seeing that in my work in Saudi Arabia, although we don't, I wish we had that underground forest. We don't, at least in the region I've been in. There may be other regions where that is very, very relevant. So it's not so much the ecological part that's surprising to me. I've got a question about the political atmosphere, because I know of other African countries where people seeking self-sufficiency had those efforts squelched by strong central governments that wanted to maintain dependence. And so I'm wondering, was there any sort of, was it just kind of a libertarian place where these people had control of their land and they weren't paying taxes on it and they were kind of free to do what they wanted? What was the political atmosphere like for them that allowed them to do this without any kind of intervention or any kind of obstacle?
Mm-hmm. So Niger inherited a forestry code from France, and it was just a carbon copy of what the French did. And in French forestry law, the government owned the trees. And this had a good intention, but the opposite outcome. Because if the tree's not yours and it's not mine, I'd better take it before you do, or I'll miss out. And the net effect of that well-intentioned policy was the total destruction of the forest from one end to the other of Niger.
Yep.
Now, fortunately, when I got there, the country was really on its knees, and I say that tongue-in-cheek. The Forestry Service was struggling financially. They couldn't send their scouts out into the villages to find people, and at the same time, democracy was coming in. People's interpretation of democracy was, great, we're now free to do whatever we want. And so there was this combination of things, a weakened forestry service that was policing the cutting of trees, a perception that we were now free, and then this white guy came in, and I said to the local foresters, your approach is failing. You set up roadblocks at the entry of every city, confiscating people's wood, but the damage has already been done. Give us the opportunity. If we can convince the farmers to regrow these trees, allow them to benefit from what they do. And of course, at the local level, those guys had no authority. They didn't give me anything in writing. But they knew that what I was saying was true. And they said, okay, go and try it. And I said to the farmers, okay, if you regenerate these trees, you can cut them, you can manage them, you can do whatever you like with them. They're yours. And they did that. And within a short period of time, there were more trees than you can poke a stick at. And the forestry department was happy because you still had to buy a permit to cut trees. They were getting their little income stream. The trees were returning, and the farmers were happy. Now, pretty much every country that I know in Africa has similar laws. And so, but because of the success of the Niger story and a few other movements, there's the Bond Challenge and the Africa 100. I don't know if you've heard of them, but these are massive initiatives to restore degraded land. And country after country are making their own commitments to how many hectares they will restore. But it's given us a voice. We say, well, if you want to mimic the Niger result, then we can walk alongside you. We can teach FMNR, but you'll need to tweak your policies to empower and enable farmers to want to do this.
Absolutely. I find in my interviews with people that more and more it is the political situation that either causes the initial problem or that prevents what is a really holistic solution. Like it's either the source of the problem or it's preventing anyone from moving forward because of local magistrates and local governorates who want to get their cut of everything, but it messes up the incentives for all the producers. And so it's interesting that for you it was in this political turning point where there was a bit of a vacuum, and you happened to be at the right place at the right time for a long time.
Yeah. And unfortunately for FMNR, it's hard to make money out of it. It doesn't require a big investment. It doesn't involve subsidies. There's something like $1 billion a year fertilizer subsidy in Africa. And people are hooked on this. It's addictive. And people in power can skim off it. And so when we come in and we say, well, actually, there's fertilizer trees that can triple your crop yields for nothing, on the face of it, you don't get much buy-in.
Yeah, because the autocrats don't see a way to profit from it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's always the governments that I have worked with, that's always been a major selling point that you've got to come up with. You've got to, if it's not that they're going to profit from it, then it has to appeal to their ego or to their legacy or to their favorability in the next election or something, because oftentimes those are the gatekeepers.
Yep.
And so it's fantastic that it turned out the way it did. It's going to have to continue to be grassroots, I think, right? It's going to have to continue to be farmer to farmer, because the incentives of a centralized government don't really dovetail with what you're doing. And I just think that's fascinating. I think it's fascinating.
Well, I'm an optimist, and you're right. The bulk of my work is still aimed at the grassroots.
Yep.
But we try to work at the government level too. And you mentioned you've got to appeal to their ego or to their own objectives, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So many governments now, they've actually committed to restoring 80 million hectares in various countries in Africa. Yes, and we can go to them and say, well, how are you going to do it? And their first response is usually, we'll plant trees.
Yeah.
And then we say, well, you've actually tried that before. It cost you a lot of money, and you haven't got anything to show for it.
Yeah.
And so then they're in a bind, because internationally they've made this declaration. We commit, like in the case of Ethiopia, 22 million hectares. And so we can say to them, look, we can help you not lose face.
Yeah.
And as World Vision, I work very closely with the World Agroforestry Center, with World Resources Institute, some of these peak bodies that have authority, they have a name with them, and we have a voice. So yes, there's always reason to doubt governments, but I guess I'm an optimist, and I look for the honest brokers there.
Well, you have to work with them the majority of the time, right?
Yes.
You don't have another option, and so that's why it makes me so happy that it worked out the way it did. Anyhow, I always ask the first questions. That's my prerogative as the guy hosting this. But we've got an audience who have been asking some things. The first was, what was the name of the species that was a reticulata? It was a P. reticulata?
Yeah. So there's two names, actually. I don't know why, but the main one that crops up is Philostigma.
Philostigma.
Yeah, Philostigma reticulata, and the other name is, sometimes it's referred to as Bohinia.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's that tree, but some of the others that are critical in those environments, Phaedherbia albida.
Yep.
That's a fertilizer tree. It's probably not good for me to list species, because in every country there's going to be a different mix. And it's really a matter of either knowing your species or trial and error, but also going to the farmers. Their traditional knowledge is so critically important.
Good call. I was trying to get some Phaedherbia seeds to trial out where we are in Saudi Arabia. Someone asked about the trees that perform hydraulic redistribution. I'm trying to find it. But it's John Lim. John, there's a function that these trees perform called hydraulic redistribution, and they have this ability to pump water actively into the ground where their taproot is, or back up to where the shallow root structures are. I've got a blog post on it on a Forsaken blog that I used to write. But there are a number of species that do this. Prosopis is a big one that does this. There are a number of acacias that also have this ability. And I don't know which one you brought up, Tony, that you said has this function where they bring subsoil water to the surface.
Yeah, that Philostigma does.
Oh, it's the same one.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Question, what have you or your farmers noticed from varying pruning intensity on trees in different stages of growth? I wonder if in early stages trees benefit from being able to produce more energy, and in later stages from focusing resources from the roots into a smaller number of shoots.
I'm sure you're correct that a lighter pruning earlier on would give more energy. The reality is you're working with farmers, and initially at least they're very scared of shading, and their tendency is to over prune. So I'm always fighting this fear that they have that the shade will suppress their food crops. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure you're right that the more leaf surface area you have, the better. And there's another reason for light pruning. Again, it's harder for wandering goats and livestock to break a bushy multi-stem plant than a single stem plant that's had all the side branches cut off. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find the trees that we leave alone tend to develop multi-stems naturally. I think they've evolved to do this after thousands of years of being in pastoral land. That's something we don't. The trees that we don't prune will just naturally be very bushy in the first 3 to 5 years, where we are in Saudi Arabia, and I suspect it's exactly because of that reason, because they will break the whole tree over, or just strip it.
But just on that, if I could just add to that, this is a sort of point of dynamic tension. The success of FMNR is because it's farmer managed. It's not Tony managed or World Vision managed. And I might have a scientifically correct, ideal pruning regime, but if I stick to my guns and insist on that, I might lose the farmer managed bit. You see what I mean? So I have to give freedom. I have to allow them to do what suits them. I can advise, I can demonstrate, but at the end of the day, I have to relinquish any authority and say, it's your tree. And so there's this tension. I often see things, oh, I wouldn't have pruned it that way, but I have to shut up.
That's wonderful. Somebody that I look up to a lot once told me it takes us 3 years to learn how to talk and 80 years to learn how to shut up. So
it's good.
You learned it early. That's the other question I have. What did it take in your early days there? Because you were an implant, right? I don't know if you knew or if you focused on any of the indigenous languages, or if you were communicating strictly in English. But what did it take for you to find those early adopters? What was your relationship like with them? And what did you have to do to get there?
Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate because the mission that I was a member of had a long history there, and they were trusted. So people went to the mission for medical needs. We had a clinic. Many of them sent their children to the mission schools. We had agricultural programs that people benefit from. And in the severe 1970s famine, missionaries and the local church distributed food. So I stepped into that. There was that appreciation.
Yeah, there was established social capital that you were affiliated with.
Thank you. And then I made a great effort at the language. I spoke Hausa, and I made great effort at that. I didn't want to have to go through a translator. I needed to be able to communicate directly. Also, before we came up with the idea of FMNR, I'd been working in those villages. We had that tree planting project, but a number of them complained that they didn't have drinking water. And we were able to get some funding, and we put in, I think it was 6 wells in 6 villages. And so there was that rapport and that trust. Then in 1984, there was a massive drought and famine, and we just dropped everything and pulled out all the stops to get food to people. So even if they hated me, even if they despised the idea of having trees in their fields, out of deference to what we were doing, people put up with us and tried the tree thing for long enough that they themselves saw the benefits.
There you go. So for that organization to be there really is what got your foot in the door. Every now and then I get emails from people who are like, I've got this really great idea for a project in Chad or Mali or Malaysia. And the first question I always ask them is, it's not, is your idea going to work? It's, what are your relationships that you have there? Because even if your idea is, going to grow paradise, who's going to listen to you and who's going to adopt it. I find that we focus so much on the ecological or the agricultural side of things, when I really think that's the simplest part. The hard part is in the human relationships and in the people systems, the politics and which are both local and centralized and national, but also in, as people with ideas, we may approach a certain community or a certain organization or a certain population, and if you don't have a foot in the door, if you don't have trust, it's not going to go anywhere anyway. And so it's your story corroborates that impression that I have, that the people systems are really what determine if it's going to get picked up or not, and if it's going to succeed, whether or not your ecological solution, is real or not.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's fascinating. You look at any USAID call for proposals, any donor recommendations, they won't mention relationship. They'll talk about the best practice and the technologies and all of this. Yeah. The key point that you've identified is always lacking. It's just amazing.
Yeah, and the fact that you were learning to speak Hausa and you were, focused on culture and indigenous knowledge, I'm sure earned you a lot of points with the people you were working with. But
yeah, you couldn't do it, and even if I blotched the language a bit, if you rolled out a few proverbs at appropriate points, they thought you were just. They had this expression: Tony speaks Hausa like a Kano donkey, which is actually a compliment, but it just has a way of engaging people that you can't do through a translator.
Absolutely. Well, have we got any more questions, folks?
Yeah, we got two. I've got one of my own, but there's two from Rob and Gloria that might be able to answer pretty quick.
All right.
Rob says, Tony, thanks for telling us about FMNR. It's wonderful to hear about the effects. Are there any broad-scale FMNR projects in Australia going on right now?
Not that I'm aware of. There's areas of forest regeneration where effectively they're doing natural regeneration as opposed to tree planting. But see, the context here is so different. Here, farming is intense. It's a commercial enterprise, and the cost of labor is through the roof. So unless you have species that have a high return, maybe a sandalwood or a high-value fruiting tree, you're not going to see that in a Western country. You would do it for environmental reasons, not necessarily for profit motive. I don't know if that's clear, but in Africa, the investment of their labor paid off. They could sell fuel wood. They saw doubling of their crop yields, and so on. So it's been a little bit hard to translate into Western agricultural setting in Australia.
Yep. Cool. Good question. Okay. Another question from Gloria. She says, are there governments that are open to this method?
Oh, definitely, and increasingly so. So I mentioned the AFR 100 initiative to restore 100 million hectares in Africa. I think it's around 20 countries that have made commitments to restore around 80 million hectares. And through World Vision's collaboration with World Resources Institute and World Agroforestry Centre, we actually have a voice at the government level, at international levels, and we're constantly flagging the Niger experience and saying this is something that's replicable. And increasingly we're hearing, we're getting positive reception of that message. It's taken time, but it's starting to sink in.
Cool. So here's a question of my own. So how are you able to quickly get people trained up so fast in this technique? Like if you didn't have the infrastructure to, quickly have the funding to go out and train people, how did they learn so quickly?
Well, you saw from the diagram, it's actually very simple and even intuitive. I could teach a child in 5 minutes. It's that simple.
Okay.
But I'll give you an example. I spoke at the Permaculture Convergence in Jordan. I think it was 2011.
Yep.
And there was a young man there from Kenya who lived on the island of Rusinga. It's in Lake Victoria. And all he did, he saw that pretty similar presentation to the one I showed you. I didn't give him a hands-on demonstration, but he took that knowledge back to Rusinga, talked to the people who were in a terrible plight. Most of the young people had left. There were no job prospects on the island, and the forest had disappeared. And with that little bit of information, he shared it. He got a movement going on that island. The thing is, you don't need money. You don't even need somebody to give you secateurs. In Niger, they sharpened their hoes. That's how poor they were. You just need inspiration.
Yeah. That's fascinating. That's amazing.
And a pocket knife.
Yeah.
That's all it takes is a pocket knife.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see if we got... Susan wonders if you have the name of that guy from Kenya.
Nicholas Senyayo, something like that. Nicholas. Yeah, Sinayo, something like that.
There you go.
But he's still active in Kenya. I keep in touch from time to time.
All right. Tony, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. We've had around 45 people listening, and we've got an audience of 6,000 that will have access to this over the next week or so. But it's really good for me personally to hear. I feel like I'm kind of following in your footsteps, but in a very different context. Mm-hmm. And so it's encouraging for me to hear, to have some impressions confirmed or disconfirmed. But also, I think your story is one that more people ought to know, and so we're really thankful you came on. Anybody else? You got any more comments before we turn this down? A couple people are asking if there are volunteer opportunities with FMNR.
World Vision's not really set up with a volunteer program. I imagine there would be places where other organizations where that's possible.
Ecosystem restoration camps, the one in Spain. You can just send John Liu a message on Facebook. They're getting that thing started.
They're looking for volunteers.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. Right. So sometimes in specific circumstances, sometimes we're in a position where we can take on an intern as part of their master's or PhD program. But unfortunately, we're not really set up with an organized volunteer program.
Yeah.
But I imagine it's something, if you go with the equivalent of a overseas volunteers abroad and Peace Corps and that, it's something that you can build into the program that you work in.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Rob says, "What in Kenya has the cooperative movement offered support for FMNR?"
Can you repeat that, please, Wayne?
Rob says, "In Kenya has the cooperative movement offered support for FMNR?"
So is that an organization?
Well, It's what you're doing, FMNR. He was just saying.
No, he means the cooperative movement. Is the cooperative movement an organization?
Yeah. You might need to rephrase that, Rob.
Yeah.
So we have a project in Kenya, and through that project we've reached out to many organizations to teach them the method, and we've tried to form a network. It's not really flying yet, but they're still actively trying to form this network. So maybe that's what he's referring to.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. Like networks of collective farmers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, for those of you who are just seeing us for the first time, Raleigh and I do these webinars on average once a week. I don't think we've ever done more than one a week, but we're taking a little bit of a break this summer.
Yeah.
Our next webinar is the 5th of July with the Green Wave folks. What's his name, Raleigh? His name is...
We got Bryn Smith. He's got a bunch of talks out. He's doing 3D ocean farming. So for those of you who one, care about the ocean, care about sustainable fishing, are connected to the ocean and want to learn about, hey, how the heck do I make a livelihood while restoring it? He's got some really, really amazing presentations he can share with it, and it's going to be really cool,
really fantastic. And this is
like
one of
ocean farming is super new.
It's the cutting edge of it's one thing permaculture doesn't do well yet is what do we do with the oceans? It's a big question. The other thing I wanted to point out is that Raleigh and I rely on subscriptions to be able to pay for the software and speaker fees and all the other stuff we need to do this. So please consider subscribing. And thanks everybody for coming out to Sustainable Design Masterclass. Thanks to you, Tony, again for your presentation.
Pleasure.
And we wish you the best of luck in spreading FMNR.
Thank you, Tony. That was inspirational. Yeah. And replay will be sent out. I just got to download it and then re-upload it. And then you'll all get an email with the replay.
There you go.
Thank you. All the best.
All right.
We'll see you.
Likewise.
Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the day. I'm going to pass out because it's 2 a.m. here. But I'll catch a few of you in Europe on my bike trip.
Take care, Raleigh.
Okay.